Hello YouTube, Old World Tales here. I present to you today part one of a piece of fiction I wrote set in the Warhammer Fantasy setting. Um, it's called The Ram's Horns, and it follows the adventures, I suppose, of the Ram's Horns Mercenary Company, um, a group who operate out of the Border Princes, a region that sort of sits between the more civilized uh, kingdoms and empires to the north, like Bretonia, Tilia, Stalia, and the Empire, and to the south, Greenskins in the Badlands, and further south still Araby and the Kemrian undead. So this is part one. I'm currently working on part two, and hopefully I'll have that out to you real soon. So sit back and please enjoy. Also, if you like what I've written, please hit subscribe and like. And please leave some comments down the bottom, just with some, helpful feedback. Um, did you like the story? Did you like the pace at which I narrated? Um, did you like the characters? Let me know. Thanks. Euron spurred on his horse. He rode at the front of a group of 2 dozen or so freemen horsemen. The mounted warriors moved in full gallop towards billowing smoke clouds on their near horizon. Wind coming down off the Apennine Mountains and across the plains of the Border Princes was pulling the smoke in pillars east towards the sea. The riders rounded a bend in the winding road and crested the last hill. Below them, the town of Kasos was in turmoil. Fires burned sporadically on the roofs of thatched houses. Panicked screams, contrasted with guttural roars, echoed up from the settlement below. Euron already knew before arriving who was responsible, and seeing the orcs daubed in blue ochre with cleavers and clubs in hand, filled him both with hatred and a relishing. He kicked his horse on further, wordless, and descended down the hillock towards the nearest group of greenskins. Following close behind him were the freemen. They were not cavalry per se, but more akin to dragoons, warriors who rode to battle and dismounted to fight. They did not carry lances or spears, but an assortment of hand weapons. All were the survivors of a catastrophe, the orphans, bachelors, or in some cases even widows of massacres, genocides, and raids. They joined the freemen bands as exactly that, free men. Men free of any other burden or responsibility outside of vengeance. Men without family, home, or community. They sought out and inflicted death on the Skaven, the bandits, beastmen, or orcs who were responsible for their loss. Each one outwardly reflected the trauma of their past, each being covered in the body parts of their preferred enemy, of that race that was responsible for inflicting the loss on them. Euron and the freemen barely slowed to dismount close to a group of orc warriors. Continuing on foot with the momentum, they crashed into the greenskins, cleaving, ducking, and stabbing. After quickly dispatching the small group, they continued forwards to the edge of the town. They immediately drew attention from large numbers of orcs and not a few goblins, who then stopped chasing and butchering townspeople and began gravitating at speed towards the men. Huron, covered in plate, with greatsword in both hands, drew up at the front, with the freemen forming a wedge behind. Those men with pistols drew them and began firing at the oncoming greenskins. When the horde was within close reach, Huron stepped forward and swung his great weapon in a wide arc, summoning strength from within with a defiant cry. He cut right through a number of orcs before his sword jarred to a stop on the shoddily made chest armor of a huge orc bighorn. The monster showed no sign of pain and batted aside his weapon. Huron stepped back into the front of the wedge of men behind him, and like a scrum they braced for the impact. The greenskins haphazardly smashed into the serried rank of men. The wedge formation allowed for attack against the orcs from two angles. An orc, even a small one, is a violent brute who through lack of a central nervous system feels little pain. To kill one takes a determined blow, and with the skillful attacks coming in at them from the freemen thick and fast, they fell easily. Under the legs of their larger orc cousins, horrible little goblins swarmed through, stabbing and biting the ankles of the men. A few of them fell to the sneaky stabbing of the gobos. Gaps appeared in the wedge, allowing a couple of orcs to bash through. The men faltered briefly, causing some to be killed by their brutish attackers, but quickly the savvy fighters pulled back, abandoning the now broken formation, and forming into small groups or even lone individuals. The enemy numbers had been depleted somewhat at this stage, and the battle was distilling down to one-on-one combat. Some men dropped back behind their comrades and reloaded pistols, while others, badly injured, retreated to the safety of the horses, still huddled together in place. In the centre, Huron, Strategos of the Ram's Horn's mercenary company, furiously swung his heavy weapon with tired effort in accomplished arcs around him, holding at bay a good proportion of the remaining orcs, while his men reformed, reloaded, or retreated. He caught an orc off balance and, taking advantage, brought his blade around and buried it in the beast's body. Using a foot to brace against the dead greenskin, he dragged his greatsword free from the entanglement of gore. As he did so, he was struck from the side and was lifted bodily off of his feet, landing a distance away. He struggled to stand, turning as he did to identify his assailant. The largest orc present that day strode towards him. The behemoth bristled with tusks and teeth and had heavy iron plate covering its body. One of the freemen closest by placed one of Huron's plate-armoured arms over his shoulder and lifted him up to his feet. Huron thanked his comrade and readied himself. The man, lightly armoured and armed, with a sword and buckler, moved in front of the orc leader. It swung its huge chopper horizontally at him, but rolling under the attack, he righted himself and hacked at the large orc's side, causing a deep gouging wound. The orc struck at the freeman with a hand, knocking him down before stomping a huge armoured foot onto his neck. The man broke with an audible, nauseating crunch. Huron hadn't been idly waiting and was already charging the orc. He pointed the long, heavy blade, with tip forward and angled up towards its face. He struck the beast under its bulky chin, and using the momentum and the power in his frame, he pushed upwards, impaling its head as it roared with rage and disbelief. It kicked out at Huron, who pivoted his body and avoided the foot from connecting. The sword was now firmly jammed up into the orc leader's head, and it thrashed around in confusion. Huron released his hold on his weapon and drew a stiletto stabbing knife from his belt. Moving around the flailing beast, he stabbed repeatedly with intent at various points on the orc until it succumbed and sunk onto the ground in a pool of its own insides. Its head lolling forward onto the ground, being held up by the protruding greatsword. Gazing around him, Huron saw that the last of the orcs were being put down by his men, with some of them, mainly the remaining goblins, in flight. He turned his attention to the man whose intervention had most likely saved him. The freeman's body had been pressed into the mud of the field by the large orc's foot. Huron turned him over and, using 2 fingers, closed the dead man's eyes. He motioned for 2 men close by. Looking at the man's body, he spoke to the newcomers. "Take him and secure him to his horse, as well as the rest of the fallen. Then assist the injured to mount up." With a curt nod, the men went about picking up the corpse. Huron walked towards the leader of the Freemen unit. Sergeant Volk was knelt over a dead orc, knife in hand, mutilating it. Volk was taking orc teeth, or teeth, as the greenskins referred to them. The orcs used their teeth as currency, but those freemen, whose settlements and families had been destroyed by orcs in particular, took them as trophies, wearing them on necklaces, arm braces, or adorning their armour or horse barding with them. Volk, the Reaper of Orcs. Quite the toll you took today, Huron said sardonically. Yes, yes it was, Lord, the sergeant replied dryly. Gather your men, Volk. We need to sweep the town and ensure that it's free of the enemy, and extinguish those fires. Yes, Lord. I will also send some of my men into the woods to gather the townspeople who have fled, and then we can go about burning the enemy dead, lest they become a future problem. Volk went about organising his men to the various tasks, with the bulk following Huron into the town. They quickly began tackling the fires, filling available buckets and barrels from the well and animal troughs, and extinguishing the worst blazes. Some locals who had been hiding or pretending to be dead among the many victims strewn along the streets came out to help. Recognizing the free men, adorned as they were with grisly trophies, and Huron with his distinctive ram's wool skin draped over his shoulder armour. Huron made his way to the town hall. The huge door was splintered and cleaved, hanging on one remaining hinge. He stepped inside. The ancient wood-carved interior was a mess. Furniture was strewn about the long vaulted space. It was dim, and no lanterns were lit. Daylight penetrated in long shards and beams here and there through small, grime-covered windows. A few unfortunates had met their end here. Their fine clothes were dyed red with their own lifeblood. Richer denizens of the town, perhaps, large estate holders or merchants. Some of them were women, and there was even a young child among them. Huron felt a bluster of emotion that stuck in his chest as he held it back with a deep breath. He knelt at the nearest victim, her lifeless stare mesmerizing him. Something darted underneath the table at the other end of the long room and snapped him back to his senses. He stood abruptly and drew his shorter blade. He cautiously advanced towards the table, which was obscured on his near side by chairs which were draped in a tablecloth. He gingerly reached out and took the cloth between forefinger and thumb. With blade in other hand raised to strike, he whipped the tablecloth away. A form was distinguishable under the table. It was obscured in the dimness of the room. Huron kicked the two chairs away, and with one hand upturned the table. To his surprise, he found not a skulking goblin, but a dishevelled and terrified boy. He cowered in a ball and shielded himself with his arms. Huron recoiled his weapon arm and put his blade away. "What's your name, boy?" The boy peered up from behind his arm but remained silent. "You are safe now. The monsters are gone." "They aren't monsters, they are greenskins," the boy retorted. "Where are your parents?" Huron asked. "Dead," he replied. Huron gave his hand out to the child. The boy grasped it and stood up. Huron led him out of the gloomy hall, stepping over the remains of his parents, and out into the afternoon sun.